That's not me on the slide. So something terrible happened to me very recently. I turned 40. Yeah, and there are varying opinions around the age at which you become useless in any given profession. And we're having, there we go, sorry. So Albert Einstein felt that it was 30. You become useless in science. Vinod Khosla, who was the co-founder of Sun, felt that it was 35. And there was a separate one at 45 when you completely become useless. How about our industry? Everyone know the Pony Awards? Okay, so if you don't, it's an annual award show during Black Hat where we recognize the achievements and failures of the past year, and it's somehow lighthearted and serious at the same time. And this is their description for Lifetime Achievement Award. And as you can see, you become eligible at age 30. Yeah, you get it. Now, everyone matures at a different pace. So if you prefer qualitative to quantitative, we have this litmus test that goes more to state of mind. You know you're old when you remember when you were trying to get people to care about improving security. Since bios are boring, here are a few loosely connected bits of info about me. Like I mentioned, I'm now 40. So by any of the measures that we just talked through, the productive part of my career is over. I'm proudly embracing my new curmudgeon status. And although when I mentioned that to a friend a couple weeks ago, he laughed in my face and he said, "Chris, you've always been a curmudgeon," which may have some truth to it. So anyway, now that I'm old, I plan to give more talks complaining about things. Now, in any industry, including our own, there's a trajectory that people follow. It takes them through a certain maturation process. I don't mean sharpening technical skills. I mean sharpening and broadening your perspective. You start out with a very narrow view of the world, and over time, you're exposed to different situations, different people, different companies, different experiences, and that view of the world that you have evolves and expands. We learn from our mistakes. And so for the past few months, I've asked dozens of people that I've come in contact with, mostly at conferences, for their opinions on the unproductive mindset or behavior that most harms the credibility of our industry at large. And so that, plus some of my own editorializing, is what I'm going to share with you today. I have no grandiose ideas about what kind of change can come from a single conference talk. Just like in penetration testing, giving a talk is like swooping in, giving advice, and taking off. But my hope is that we can at least collectively agree that some of the themes we talk about today are worth digging into, so that eventually the newcomers to our industry can fast forward that early maturation process and avoid some of these mistakes. I hope not to sound preachy. If that happens, I apologize in advance. My goal is to just spawn some discussion. So what do I want from you today? Just to listen, be introspective, be honest with yourself about whether you've done or whether you've thought any of these things. You may instinctively feel defensive. That's fine. And of course, I don't need to tell a crowd like this, but feel free to disagree with me about whether any of these things are actual problems. So I've broken down these topics into a few themes that build upon one another. So let's get started. Let's talk about failure. We love to fixate on how terrible everything is and how we've failed as an industry. Why exactly have we failed? Is it because breaches happen? Because sometimes systems get compromised? I don't know when security evolved into a contest of who's the most defeatist. But far too often it seems like we revel in the things that we've struggled with, and we shortchange the things that we've succeeded at. Sometimes we're Eeyore. We like it when things are terrible. This makes us feel good somehow. I'm going to start with InfoSec Taylor Swift, because it guarantees that if anybody ever watches a recording of this talk, like 10 years from now, they're going to have no idea why this is relevant whatsoever. But this saying, if it's connected to the internet, it's already compromised. Now, this sort of saying has grains of truth to it. I think we can all agree to that. But it's become a way for us to somehow claim responsibility for the brittleness of a worldwide computer network that was designed without any insight into today's threat model. right? So how is it that we have failed exactly? This tweet was a summary of the Mirai botnet. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a genius tweet, and it's a great example of dark humor that centers around this theme of failure. Right, now, I don't really know Jeff well, but based on the medium, Twitter, I'm pretty sure it was meant just to evoke humor. I don't think he was truly feeling defeated when he tweeted that, but maybe. The underlying theme is still there, isn't it? Like, we're so bad at this, we can't even prevent toasters from taking down the internet. What's the outcome of that kind of mindset? Well, here's one example. Casey Ellis, he's the CEO of BugCrowd, tweeted this last month on World Mental Health Day, trying to sum up how many InfoSec practitioners feel on a daily basis. Not because they're bad at their jobs, but because of the frame of reference that we've put around it, the frame of inevitable failure. And for people who truly believe the security industry is a failure, and to be clear, you should not fall into that trap, it's not too hard to see how they could identify with this description, right? Your goal is to stay in the ring for as long as possible until you lose. Wow. So what can we do differently on this topic? Well, first, stop framing everything as failure. Our industry is not a failure. It's fun to say, but we're not. Avoid thinking in such extreme terms as success versus failure. Be honest about things we can do better, but also celebrate successes. Make useful suggestions about how we can improve rather than just pointing out the bad. And I was thinking, where did this whole mindset even come from? What is the root cause? And it dawned on me that it all has to do with how we define failure. We define failure as not perfect. Not perfect. Think about how ridiculous that is. If your kid comes home from school with a 99% on a test, raise your hand if you'd consider that to be a failure. Okay, thankfully. Oh my God, of course there's one. All right, of course. All right, so let's talk about perfection. You may have heard this before. Perfect is the enemy of good. It's a saying that was originally popularized by Voltaire in the 1600s, believe it or not. I mean, who knew there were MBAs during the French Enlightenment? But the point is, we've known about the pitfalls of perfectionism for quite some time. More to the point, in our industry, this mindset manifests something like this. You didn't build this thing in the best possible way. How stupid it is that you're taking steps in the right direction. It is. Anything that takes time to build or has to be done in a phased approach is demonized for its lack of perfection rather than praised for making progress. Somebody can come up with a product or a defensive technique that works 99% of the time, and we'll fixate on the 1% of the time that it doesn't. This may be a little harsh, but I felt the analogy was so perfect that I had to share it with you. I'll let you read it. Does that resonate? As we think about how we sometimes have unreasonable demands for perfection. So I thought this was a great analogy, although a little depressing. Okay, participation, not really, but raise your hand if you've ever heard the attacker only has to find one way in, the defender has to stop every attack. Some of you are lying. Come on, raise your hand if you've ever heard it. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up if you've ever heard that saying. Okay. Now, keep your hand up if you've ever said it aloud. Okay, now, keep your hand up. No, keep your hand up if you've ever said it non-ironically in a conference presentation. Thank you for your honesty. You can put your hands down now. I have too. I mean, I'm guilty of it. This even has a name, this idea, the defender's dilemma. Okay, now tell me what purpose this mindset has, other than defeatism. Other than convincing the person on the receiving end that defending is impossible. So I challenge you to stop using this worn-out phrase. It's harmful. There is nobody having an epiphany after hearing that statement. They just feel less motivated to build that really cool thing they were thinking about because people are just going to point out that it's not perfect. And you know what else is interesting? Our behavior doesn't match our rhetoric, and this is a good thing. Heartbleed happened in 2014, and subsequent to that, there's been a huge amount of scrutiny on OpenSSL. Right? There have been a lot of vulnerabilities that came out of that. Some of them were pretty big. And for the most part, we're not calling for extreme measures. No one is saying go back to plain text. A couple people are trying to reinvent OpenSSL. That's great, but most of us are just patching. We're pragmatic. But that's not the rhetoric that we talk about when we talk about perfection. Everything has to work all the time, right? And you have to zoom out to really appreciate how things have improved. So for example, look at the state of operating system level defense over the past 10 years. This is not my slide, which is why there's lots of small text on it. But this was taken from a Blue Hat presentation this past January by David Weston and Matt Miller at Microsoft. And what it's showing is how much more complicated it's gotten to exploit a vulnerability in Windows over the past 10 years. It's really staggering. When I was learning how to write Windows exploits about 1 billion years ago, the only OS level mitigation that we had to get around at the time was nothing. At most you'd have to deal with a restricted character set, or maybe write your own shellcode, something like that, because there was no Metasploit. But those were just characteristics of the target program. It wasn't an OS level mitigation itself. Look at what you have to do to write a reliable browser exploit in 2016. Over there on the right. So each one of those steps with the little bullet by it. Escape the sandbox is a bullet point at the end. After you've done all this other stuff, oh yeah, just escape the sandbox. No big deal. It's hard. And it's not just the Microsoft people overstating what they've built. Here you have Halvar Flake, one of the smartest and most respected attackers, breakers in our industry, reflecting on how much more difficult offense has become. And he's talking about time to exploit, which is the time from when you discover the vulnerability to the point where you have a working exploit. Not necessarily a reliable, works every time exploit, but an exploit. And there's his metric. 15 years ago, it took a day. 10 years ago, it took a week. And now it takes months. Mark Dowd agrees. Mark Dowd, the guy who in 2007 figured out how to turn a null pointer vulnerability, something that we always thought was unexploitable, in Flash into a reliable cross-browser bytecode verifier destroying exploit, he agrees that it's gotten harder. So if you have guys like this saying that defenders are moving the needle in a significant way, I tend to believe it. So sure, we haven't solved every problem. Offense and defense will always be a cat and mouse game, but defenders have really raised the stakes, haven't they? It's not perfect, but it's a lot of progress. So, sorry, I meant to advance that. So, how can we avoid falling into this rhetorical trap? Well, first, beware false dichotomies. There is a middle ground between perfection and failure, really. Apply the 80-20 rule, or the 90-10 rule, whatever makes sense for you. It helps to remind you that an imperfect solution can still have real value. Take a page from Agile Scrum and think in terms of iteration. Sometimes it helps to put something out there and start using it, which then helps you figure out how to improve it over time. To be clear, what I'm saying is not to pretend that things are perfect. I'm saying to be realistic about what's possible and be okay with that. But we don't stop at proclaiming ourselves as failures. We like to project. Developers are failures too, and clearly we're not alone at poking fun at them. I really need to Google what developers are crabgrass means. I should do that, but anyway, so we're not the only ones that like to poke fun, but we're also not off the hook for it. So let's talk about stupid developers. Let me take you back 5 years to the OWASP summit in Lisbon. For anybody who doesn't know what OWASP is, there's probably 2 of you in here, it's the Open Web Application Security Project, founded in 2001 by Mark Curphey to raise awareness of application security issues on the web. The projects are run by volunteers. In 2003, OWASP released something called the OWASP Top 10. And a few years later, the OWASP Top 10 became part of first the Visa CISP standard, and then eventually the PCI DSS standard, and then the rest is history. Nothing, I think, contributed more to OWASP becoming a standard bearer for software security than Section 6 of the PCI DSS. So here we are in 2011, over 5 years after OWASP is the de facto standard, well known around the world. And at this invite-only summit of quote-unquote influential web security people, somebody literally goes up and says this on stage. I honestly don't remember who it was. It's not important, because 99% of us have said it at some point. So immediately, John Willander, who's awesome, tweets this out. And he's right. Most of us don't know a lot about development. And John followed up his tweet a few days later with a blog post citing surveys he's done where he asked developers about their software priorities. Security appears somewhere on that list of priorities. Does anybody want to guess what number 1 is? It should be probably pretty easy. You're a software developer. Functions and features, then performance, then usability, then uptime, then maintainability, then security. We're number 6. So getting back to the failure theme, we view this as a failure to care about security, but really it's just a prioritization exercise. Why don't developers know more about security? It's not because they're stupid. There are plenty of resources online now. I can go Google and learn about secure coding techniques, right? Developers just aren't doing it because security is a lower priority for them and their managers and the people who write their paychecks. Yeah, I'm quoting myself. Another one of the breakout sessions at the same OWASP summit was about developer outreach. It's like, wow, great. We should be doing more of that. I went to it. There were 4 people. They were very, very telling. So OWASP is one of the most visible and recognizable security organizations in the world with a stated mission to help organizations with application security. So if OWASP thinks this way, even behind closed doors, how can we expect that attitude and culture not to permeate our industry? And just to clarify, things have started to improve since then, but not enough. I hear the stupid developer sentiment less these days, but I still hear it. And I hear it mostly from newcomers, oftentimes the breakers, who have never built software themselves to ship or been responsible for infrastructure. And it's also pretty bad within pockets of the hacker community who think if it's easy to break, it must be easy to fix. Hence this. So as we think about communicating with developers, let me give you a parallel that has nothing to do with security or even technology, as you might have guessed by this picture. So in the late 1800s, the suffrage movement in America was fragmented. There were a few different factions, all pushing to get women the vote, but their arguments were totally different. In one corner, you had the justice argument, an appeal to fairness, the idea that voting was an unalienable right. Okay, over here, you had the societal reform argument, the idea that because women were moral and domestic, their votes would be good for the country. Finally, you had the home protection argument. And this one was actually put forth by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the idea was that women could help protect against the tyranny of drink. That women, being morally superior to men, needed the vote in order to fight alcohol abuse. And it turned out that this last one, the home protection argument, was the argument that really helped the movement gain steam beyond the original suffragists, who were viewed as radicals. Getting rid of alcohol was something that resonated with the people. And getting women the vote was a way of achieving that. The other point is that no single argument here was the magic bullet. Getting women full voting rights was about understanding what mattered to people. I borrowed that story from this book, and here's how the author sums up what happened. Got a really weird angle here. Instead of assuming that others share our principles or trying to convince them to adopt ours, we ought to present our values as a means of pursuing theirs. It's much easier to link our agendas to familiar values that people already hold. This sounds very kumbaya. But how can you use this idea to bring security to development? One thing you can do is get more involved in the development process. Do your dev teams use Agile Scrum? Go to Scrum Master training. Learn the terminology, learn about the Agile ceremonies. Do they do DevOps? Go to the Velocity Conference or DevOps Days, or go read some books about it. Go read the DevOps Handbook that just came out. At the very least, spend some time with your engineering managers to get a sense of their tools and their processes, their motivations, and their values. And figure out how you can improve security within the frame of what matters to them. If you have any doubts whatsoever that this approach works, presenting your values as a means of pursuing other people's values, I present this exhibit without further comment. Oh, my timing just screwed up. My clicker's not working. Without further comment, okay? For all the times that go off. Okay, so what can we do here? Quit it with the developer fail thing. I know the failure memes and the GIFs are really funny, but can I just tell you, a lot of that stuff does not land well with the exact people you're asking to prioritize the thing you care about. Call out your peers when you hear them say stuff like this. Ask them how that approach is productive. When we treat developers as others, it's difficult to achieve the outcomes we want. And where they're coming from, their motivations, what drives them. I don't know. All right, let's talk about victim blaming. Is everyone familiar with the concept of victim blaming? Yes, nods. Okay. The Wikipedia definition states that victim blaming occurs when the victim of a crime or any wrongful act is held entirely or partially responsible for the harm that befell them. You hear the term most often these days in conjunction with sexual assault. It's the notion that a rape victim deserved to be raped because she was dressed provocatively or she'd been drinking or had a reputation. Obviously, we can all agree this is ludicrous, right? Nobody deserves to be assaulted. A crime is a crime. And if you read up on victim blaming, you will also hear about the just world hypothesis, or the just world fallacy, which is the more general idea that people deserve what happens to them. The idea that people need to believe one will get what one deserves so strongly that they will rationalize an inexplicable injustice by naming the things the victim might have done to deserve it. So for example, outsiders might deride people whose houses were just destroyed by a tornado, saying that they shouldn't have lived in a disaster-prone area, or they should have built a stronger house, right? It's psychological. We look for these reasons why they got what they deserve, why it was their fault. And let's bring that concept of victim blaming back to cybersecurity. This was the funniest hacker stock image I could find. What's our immediate reaction when we first hear about a breach? It depends on your current role and what your career path has looked like. But for a lot of security people, it's, I wonder what they screwed up. Because obviously they did something wrong. Probably not only wrong, but also stupid. And therefore, they deserved what was coming to them. Yeah, have you ever said something like that? You don't have to raise your hands. I've said it. To be completely honest with you, it's still my first instinct. Because some of the mistakes that lead to breaches really are easy to avoid. But that's different than saying a company deserved to be breached. It's the cybersecurity equivalent of she was asking for it because she was wearing a short skirt. So no, we have to stop jumping to blame victims. The attacker is the criminal. Here's another analogy I like from somebody you might recognize if you were here yesterday. Going on about how stupid victims are is like watching people be mad at cancer patients for not fighting hard enough. Isn't it interesting how that changes your frame of reference? Nancy Leveson from MIT gave a presentation a few years back where she described how safety engineering needs to evolve to cope with increasingly complex software systems. And one of the conclusions of her research looking at safety culture across a number of organizations was that certain behaviors of those organizations or cultural elements were impediments to learning. Blame is the enemy of safety, she found. Organizations didn't learn to improve when they were fixated on honing in on a single root cause. Organizations didn't improve when they oversimplified incidents to linear cause-effect relationships instead of looking for systemic factors. And basically, they did themselves a disservice by being overly eager to assign blame. So what happens when there's too much of an emphasis on blame? People stop reporting problems. People stop trusting each other. The culture becomes less transparent. I hope you can see the parallels here. It's very convenient to blame that one developer who forgot to parameterize a SQL query, or the one executive who left their laptop in the seat back pocket. But let's imagine they didn't make those mistakes. Let's say there were layered defenses in place to catch many of these problems in advance. Developer training, source code analysis, penetration testing, phishing awareness, endpoint monitoring, application whitelisting, and so on. You can still get breached. You can still do everything right and still get breached. And there would still be someone who'd point to something that you should have done or that you should have been doing. We have a lot of glass houses in Schadenfreude, and it's not helpful if the overarching goal is improvement. So let's stop being so gleeful about breaches. Let's try to have a little empathy for what victims are going through instead of rattling off a dozen reasons why they deserve what was coming to them. Assume your own people have good intentions, that they aren't actually being lazy or stupid. And look for systemic issues rather than oversimplifying to a single root cause. Have you ever heard of the 5 whys as a management technique? It's a very similar concept. Let's talk about dogma and best practices. Best practices. Even saying best practices just makes you feel smart, doesn't it? It's the best way. And I think far too often we'll slap that label onto guidance that could be better described as advice I thought seemed reasonable. Or worse, advice that is way overkill for the situation, but it's my favorite way, and I used it in that other pen test report once, and it's easy to copy and paste. I know some of you have done this. So first, do you believe me that we overload the term best practices? Like, is that legit? Let me prove it to you. Okay. You can't read what's in there on the right. Doesn't matter. It's a password policy. I guarantee you that this ridiculous password policy is at least partly the result of some security person saying, this is the best practice for password complexity. And probably right this minute, some pen tester somewhere is inventing his own version of a password complexity policy and slapping the words best practice on it. So you all can probably think of other examples of best practices that are horribly misused, but none that necessarily have entire Tumblrs and Twitter accounts dedicated to documenting them. And this is a really, really good account, by the way. Sometimes we even make our very wrong best practices into infographics. Someone posted this during one of those scheduled Twitter chats not too long ago. And notice how it promotes a completely outdated advice in support of this cutesy underpants analogy. So you all know that frequent password changes are a bad idea, right? So there was some research at the University of North Carolina back in 2010, and that was followed up by some studies at NIST and a few other studies. And they all showed that frequent mandated password changes are generally ineffective. Even the US government knows this. Lori Craner at the FTC has been leading the charge to get rid of this mandate within US government agencies. This is 6-year-old outdated advice. But when someone posted this, it got retweeted a lot. And I'm not linking to the actual tweet because they don't deserve to be shamed. Point is, appropriate guidance requires context. Stop calling something a best practice unless it's truly and objectively the best way to solve something, regardless of business context. And when you start thinking about it that way, I guarantee your advice is going to get better because you'll start asking better questions. Here's an example of context. Imagine you're building security in a small company, like a startup, and your security team doesn't have the resources of a large company. You have 2 pawns and a penny. You're walking a fine line between shipping a product or losing a lot of revenue because you didn't ship. And for even early stage companies, this decision can be existential. You have to be willing to make some security trade-offs, and you may choose to take on some security debt in order to make a ship deadline. So you don't implement the best practice solution. Is this wrong? Not if you made a conscious choice about the trade-offs. Rob Graham describes it the same way, that we forget sometimes in our insistence on doing things our favorite way is that security is a trade-off. With unlimited budget, security is easy. The hard thing about security is deciding how to get the best bang for your buck. Another problem is that often the things we report and spend money fixing are divorced from real risk. And this is another side effect of having no context. There are entire categories of vulnerability used to pad pen testing reports. And then people go and spend real time and real money fixing things that matter only very, very marginally. But wait, you should fix those weak ciphers, right? Because what if a nation state is after you? That would raise the cost of attack for that nation state. If you haven't read this paper, go read this paper immediately after this talk. It's called This World of Ours by James Mickens. You're either dealing with Mossad or not Mossad. And the vast majority of you are dealing with not Mossad. My favorite line in the paper, the Mossad is not intimidated by the fact that you employ HTTPS. This is a genius paper. Daniel Miessler from IOActive wrote an excellent blog post around the same topic, that obscurity can be a valid security layer. Again, not that obscurity should be your only defense, but it can be a valuable addition. One example is using an alternate port for common services, which cuts back drastically on the opportunistic attacks that come from the internet. It's not a substitute for patching. It's not real security, but it reduces attacks. A few years ago, there was a slide deck by Thomas Tacek and Corey Scott, similarly, about cheap things you can do to confuse attackers while not actually improving security. For example, one tip was creating encrypted-looking parameters in your web application that actually do nothing at all. But this is good advice because the attacker's going to look at it and they're going to be like, ooh, there's something juicy in here, but there's not. So this is good advice. If it's cheap enough to implement and you're cash-strapped, how many times have you heard the dogma that security through obscurity is bad, full stop? Not always bad. Here's the worst part about the dogma we often cling to. We give must-do advice that we don't even follow ourselves. Now, obviously, this is not a serious example, but the fact that a Usenix security cake didn't allocate enough space is a perfect analogy for do as we say, not as we do. I just love that. Behaving differently for us is really hard, especially when you read about security decisions that don't seem to make any sense. So maybe you remember this story. If not, you can go read about it. The point is that a lot of people, myself included, publicly excoriated United Airlines for redesigning their security questions UI in a particular way. And let's just say their implementation is never going to appear on any best practices list anywhere. But when you ask around, you find that they did in fact do a risk assessment, and they made a data-driven choice to address certain risks better, ones that they don't talk about publicly. So despite what it looks like from the outside, it's an improvement from their point of view. And I guarantee you when they were making this decision, there are some numbers behind that. There's probably some fraud numbers or some actual lost revenue based on going a different way, or increase in support calls, or any number of things that could be described in monetary terms. I'd love to know the details. I would love to read this risk assessment, but I won't. We won't get to poke around at it, and that's just the way things are. But we all assumed that they didn't do any risk assessment, and that was wrong. Another one from Wendy. Wendy's so smart. I think this is useful. Just try saying this. The security choice doesn't look good to me, but I don't know all the internal risk analysis that went into it. And it sounds kind of dorky, so you can just say it in your head if you want. You don't have to say it out loud. But it's a good way of kind of framing your reaction to something like that. So what's our takeaway from this section? Resist the urge to present dogma as best practices. Avoid the phrase best practices entirely if you can. I would love to see that go away, because it usually means you're ignoring context. Remember that security decisions are trade-offs, and not everybody has the resources to build the security features they want to build. And don't be so quick to rush to judgment when you don't have all the information. It just makes us seem condescending. OK, this part might be a little controversial, but maybe not in this audience. I'm not sure. But anyway, let's talk about hacker cred. The topic came up far more often than I expected in these conversations I've had, and from some people that I truly did not expect to hear it from. So I'm going to try and sum up what I think is actually a fairly complex situation. Here's our starting point. The aggressiveness by which someone self-identifies as a hacker is almost always inversely proportional to how much they are one. Cool, huh? This tweet is not what inspired me to write this section, but it just so perfectly captures the sentiment that I wanted to open with it. Okay, so lots of us were outsiders growing up. We had a little bit of a chip on our shoulders. Information was currency. It was pre-Google. You had to prove your worthiness to be accepted to certain BBSs by answering questions, most of which were like, what does this acronym mean, as opposed to like actual real technical knowledge. Does that sound like any of today's security certifications to you? Anyway, the point was that you had to work up to being accepted to varying degrees. And this same sort of thing happened in the hacker community, right? You build up your credibility over time. And over time, our little niche became an actual industry. Wow, who would have thought? But I would dare to say that some people still have a bit of a Peter Pan complex, and they want to make sure that others know about the social capital that they've built up in the hacker community over the years. Peter Pan doesn't want to go away. So, quick sidebar. Are you familiar with the concept of signaling? It's the sociological idea that your words or your actions signal to others that you're a member of a group. For example, if I referred to this group as y'all, you might infer I grew up in the American South. If I called you yins, you know I might have spent some time in Pittsburgh, or possibly I'm making fun of somebody from Pittsburgh. If I say you guys when I'm at home in Boston, and then I switch to y'all when I'm visiting Texas, that's a related linguistic phenomenon called code switching. And the hacker community does similar things to signal group membership, but in more explicit ways than speech patterns. And this is what I think Sean was referring to when he described the aggressiveness by which someone self-identifies as a hacker. Another friend described it to me as embracing the stereotype of hacker mystique as a means of signaling that you belong. So for example, wearing only black t-shirts as a way of signaling to others that you have similar interests. Or volunteering stories about how you totally own something. It's like, cool story, bro. I'm glad you hacked that toaster, but we were actually talking about scotch. So, yeah. Name dropping is super common. But to me, the worst signal of all, the worst one that is so often used to signal like, I'm one of you, is extreme levels of unwarranted paranoia. Tell me if you've heard this one. I'm not turning on my phone or my computer the entire time I'm in Las Vegas. I refer you back to the Mossad, not Mossad argument. Acting like someone's always out to get you may signal credibility to other hackers. But to the rest of the world, the people that we're trying to influence, by the way, you look like somebody who is completely incapable of assessing risk. And now I'm supposed to trust you when you tell me how to prioritize risk on your network? You're going to listen to me when I tell you what's important, and I'm sitting here wearing my tinfoil hat? The irony here is that we have an entire branch of our profession dedicated to blending in, exploiting trust, and being persuasive. Social engineering, if you didn't get that. The difference is that it's usually tactical. Hey, hold open that door for me. Rather than strategic. Hey, let's think about how we handle vulnerability disclosure over the next 3 years. But the raw skills are there. And you don't even have to dress up like a delivery person to do it. And maybe some of you are skillful at switching in and out of the hacker persona. There are a few examples of people who are really, really good at, kind of hacker over here and then like very professional, very persuasive, type person the next day, very effective. But those people are the minority. So here's my question. Is it more important to preserve that anti-establishment paranoid hacker culture, or to wake up to the fact that with all the attention being paid to cybersecurity now, that we have an opportunity to be very influential? Some of you already are. It's really inspiring to watch friends do good for our industry and the public interest, and it would be great to see more of that. I mean, you look at the stuff Katie's doing yesterday. I mean, it's just like, just very inspiring. So, to be persuasive requires us to adapt, to think about how we're being perceived. And I know a big part of the hacker identity is I don't care what anyone thinks of me. So that's a tough thing to reconcile. I get that. But let's face it, that can sometimes be counterproductive. I think we have to have more humility. We have to be more pragmatic. Because I want our industry to be painted in a positive light. So I'd like to ask you to think about if there are any changes to the way that you carry yourself professionally that would help drive our industry and our collective goals forward. Or if not you, some of the people that work for you. What kind of advice can you give them to help along those lines? So let's move on. So as I was going through my notes and organizing all these thoughts into similar themes, there were a few left at the end that I wanted to cover but didn't feel warranted their own section. So I decided to group them together. And the first topic is squirrels. Stop obsessing over 0-day and vulnerabilities with logos. I get it. It's cool to read about a new attack. That doesn't mean it's automatically a priority to defend against. Time and time again, you read about successful, coordinated malware campaigns that did not rely on 0-day at all. And we've known this for a while. Microsoft's Security Intelligence Report in 2011 came to these conclusions. They studied malware propagation in the wild, found that 99% of attempted attacks involved no 0-day. An update was already available. 0-day was barely relevant in the overall picture. Yet when some shiny new vulnerability comes out, especially the past few years with the branding and the logos, the media hype somehow convinces people that objective prioritization does not matter. It's in the news, so we should drop everything and patch Poodle. No, you really shouldn't. Dave made this point during his S4 keynote. There's a dichotomy of things that are easy to scan for and things that are actually risky, and they're very different sets. So when your CEO or your customer calls you up and demands to know what you're doing about Poodle, they are conflating vulnerability and risk. Don't let them do this. Because when we're constantly putting our effort into chasing these squirrels, we're by definition neglecting other things that are probably more important. This plays into another theme, which is dismissiveness of boring stuff, boring work that is actually important. It's like we only want to do stuff if it's fun, which explains the Poodle fire drills. Ooh, that's way more fun than reading these logs or doing whatever else I was doing. And Jason Street has said this many times, and I love it. You're not a rock star, you're a dentist. Get over yourself. I love that quote so much, and I hate the term security rock star equally. Second leftover thing, thought leaders. Anybody who knows me at all knows I'd mention this eventually. This term has come to mean a lot of things, including person who gives a lot of presentations and person who says controversial things for the sake of it. The thing is that the doers and the talkers don't overlap as much as you'd like. The doers are too busy getting stuff done to spend all their time on the road talking about it. And so we end up with non-doers, many of whom have never spent time in the trenches, abdicating certain directions or ways of thinking without ever having firsthand experience. And this is not unlike 70-year-olds in Congress who have never sent an email deciding how software should be regulated. I mean, thankfully, they have advisors, but sometimes those advisors are the thought leaders who have never done the thing before, and that's really scary. We should encourage more of the doers to speak and present and share what they know. Third leftover thing, stupid users and dismissiveness of user experience. We victim blame users in the same way we victim blame corporations. Making security easier is a UX problem just as much, if not more so, than a technology problem. Yet most of the time we design interfaces like this one, and we expect users to just know what to do. I'm not sure what this is, but I just searched for like bad UX. Anyway, users make bad security decisions for two reasons. Number one, either good ones are not available, or because the UX is confusing or user hostile. You want to know the most user hostile thing I see from time to time? Websites that prevent you from pasting into the password field. Basically, they're saying, we're going to make it as hard as possible for you to use a password manager and to choose unique passwords per site. And surely that's not their actual intent, right? Probably. The most likely explanation is what? Probably some consultant told them it was a best practice. And then look how they justify it in this tweet. This poor customer support person that got so much flack over this. UX matters. On the other end of the spectrum, some companies agonize over UX. Look at the Google Chrome security team. They spent years analyzing how to present SSL error messages to users in ways that are clear and encourage the right decisions. Adrian Felt did a talk about this at AppSec California in 2015. And she was presenting information about the study they did where they looked at user behavior. They made numerous iterations on the text of the error messages, the layout of the warning boxes, other tweaks, and all of those led to safer decisions by users that were measurable. Then a few months after all of that, Adrian's sister asked her why there was sometimes a picture of a red purse in the address bar. So even for a company with the resources and the dedication of Google, UX is a hard problem. So don't overlook it, and don't let engineers design the UI for security features. Final leftover thing, sexism. This deserves an entire talk and even an entire conference track. And argue all you want about whether the industry is or isn't welcoming to women or other marginalized groups. It's good, right? I've heard enough stories firsthand to know that it's a challenge for women. So I'm not the right person to talk in depth on this, but I'm going to ask you to do 3 things on this theme. Number 1, believe victims when they share their experiences. Number 2, publicly call out bad behavior when you see it. And number 3, stop using that awful analogy, so simple my mom could use it. Aiming for simplicity is good. That particular analogy is not good. So easy, my cat could use it. I use that all the time. I don't even have a cat. People know what you mean, right? And you don't have to make fun of moms. So let's wrap it up. I'm going to go a little bit over, but not too much. So I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of the things that I talked about today have to do with the nature in which we communicate. Our intentions are good. We want to get our ideas across, but sometimes we do it in these ham-fisted or extreme ways, where we take the same approach over and over, and then we can't understand why our message isn't getting through. Got me to thinking about a behavioral communication model called LPMD that I've come to learn quite a bit about over the past few years. And the model was originally designed by a Purdue psychologist named Dr. Taby Kaler. And it was most famously used by NASA in the 1970s to predict very accurately which astronauts would work together most effectively under stressful situations. The model suggests that there are 6 personality types, each of which has certain communication preferences, motivational needs, and distress patterns. And the idea is that we all have a base type, where we establish this very early in our lives by age 5 or 6. And that during our lives, most of us will phase out of our base type into other types. And that's in response to long-term periods of intense distress. So not I had a bad day, but I had a bad couple years. And then you may phase into another personality type. It's a very interesting model. And there is one base personality type called Persister. And it comprises 10% of the American population. If I were a betting man, I would guess that percentage is a lot higher among security people. And here's why. Stand over here. The Persister is dedicated, observant, and conscientious. They believe that values are essential virtues. They're motivated by recognition of their convictions. Sound right so far? As persisters experience pressure and distress, they notice faults in others. They notice more of what is wrong than what is right. They may go on the attack, preaching to others from a strong belief system in a self-righteous and condescending manner. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Now, this framework is just a tool. Identifying your own base type and phases within this model gives you a framework for understanding how you respond to different communication styles and what your distress patterns are and how you'll react. But more importantly, it gives you some tools for adapting your communication style to people you interact with, if you can kind of make guesses about what their type is and what will resonate with them. Have you ever noticed, especially during the presidential campaigns of the 90s, how Bill Clinton has the ability to really connect with audiences during his speeches? Part of it is sheer natural ability, obviously. But he also very skillfully builds in language that appeals to each of the 6 personality types. In fact, Dr. Kaler and the LPMD model played a big part in developing how President Clinton interacted with the electorate. He reviewed his speeches. So there's a lot more complexity to this model than what I'm sharing now. If you're interested, there are a variety of behavioral consulting firms that have multi-day trainings on this. They're very interesting. The takeaway for you today is that learning about communication techniques, whether it's through a model like this or some other model, can help you have more effective interactions in the workplace, or really anywhere, even in your personal life. So here's the recap of what we covered. If you agree that some or all of them are counterproductive to what our industry wants to achieve, that's exactly what I was going for. Awesome. I doubt anybody agrees with all of it. If you're not convinced and you just want to take some time to think about more, I'm happy that I've planted a seed. How do we change? Start with yourself. Lead by example. That's all I have. Thank you for listening.